when people say, oh, well, there's not one thing that's going to fix all of your problems, sometimes I disagree with that. Sometimes I think that it really can just be one thing, because it's not just one thing that's doing one thing. It's one thing that's doing like 50 million different things that your body needs.
If you have been programmed to think that all of your cravings are your body trying to trick you into getting fat, obese, and unhappy, you're going to think that everything that your body is telling you is wrong. But then you can reconcile this with the idea that, sugar might be good for you in some contexts at least, but our body might not have the ability to differentiate between the Pop-Tart and the orange that's sitting on your counter.
I don't really think there's a huge difference between alternative and conventional medicine. I think there's things that are proven, there's things that are unproven, there's things that are kind of in that gray area where we don't really know. And at the end of the day, when you're trying to help somebody, your goal is to look at all available evidence, right?
Welcome back to Recommended Daily Value. I'm your host, Tyler Woodward, and in today's episode, I had the pleasure of interviewing Grant Fowler of Fowler Fitness. Grant is a really smart guy with a bunch of controversial takes in the health and fitness industry. So that's kind of what we dive in to discuss. We talk about how he manages social media, what he thinks is lacking in the social media space, and a lot of the philosophy behind health and fitness and how to navigate that world for yourself between evidence-based and anecdote, holistic medicine, and conventional medicine, really finding the truth for yourself. But before we dive in, make sure to hit that like and subscribe button and give us a 5-star review wherever you're podcasting, and I will see you guys in there. Grant Fowler, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me, man.
Yes, sir. Thanks for coming on. So how you doing today?
I'm doing great, dude. I just took some exogenous ketones for the first time in I want to say maybe a year. I used to take those all the time. I mean, that was like the one thing that I found, and I'm sure we could go off on a huge tangent on this too. One thing I found that actually gives me good brain energy. I've tried every nootropic under the sun. And so I recently started doing those again. And I feel like anytime I do that, my brain's just on fire. I just have raw fuel to do whatever I need to do. So I'm doing great. I feel great right now.
I'm glad to hear it. I usually find that, I know you have a B complex that's a really well formulated. And I usually find a similar effect with B vitamins.
Right? Yeah, the B complex is, I think that so many people, because it's a water soluble nutrient, and I think that along with magnesium and some of these other water solubles and vitamins and stuff, it's when you give people those two things, it's you just flip a switch for some people. It's not to say that it's going to be the fix for everybody, for chronic fatigue, but I think sometimes it can be. That's the crazy thing about health is you can have all of these different potential contributing factors. And for one person, it's they just need this one thing, So it's when people say, oh, well, there's not one thing that's going to fix all of your problems. Sometimes I disagree with that. Sometimes I think that it really can just be one thing, because it's not just one thing that's doing one thing. It's one thing that's doing 50 million different things that your body needs, right? That's controlled by all of these other downstream and upstream, processes and things. With magnesium, we know magnesium controls and regulates, tons of different enzymatic reactions in the body. And so it's you give that person magnesium and all of a sudden, all of these other things that they need magnesium for is just, their body just works, right? Because you're giving it this thing that it was missing. And then for some people, maybe that's not the limiting factor. Maybe their chronic fatigue is well, you've been living in a moldy house for the past 3 years. So magnesium, maybe it's going to help you detoxify and do some things on kind of a basic level, but it might not be enough for you to feel what you need to feel, if that makes sense.
Especially if you can plug that, missing hole in the mitochondrial chain. If you are missing X nutrient and then you can solve it, basically. It's not I highly doubt Panax ginseng is going to be your cure-all. But if you have a foundational nutrient that's missing and then you can plug that in, you're probably going to see huge benefits.
Oh yeah, that's what I love about nutrition is that it's always a puzzle, man. I get some people that do coaching with me that, they'll sign up and they have all these problems and we give them one or two things and they cancel the coaching 2 months later because they feel good. Other people, it's you take that. That's why I like to just take a basic approach with everybody at first. And this also ties into the way that I program and do, and sorry if I'm answering questions that you already have on here, but
go ahead.
If if I'm like working with a client and I'm having them do, whether it's nutritional or training, like I think that a lot of people just need to start doing the same thing. Like you can take people with like a variety of different issues and you can all give them sort of these basic foundational things that everybody needs. And then you can go from there, right? Because if somebody's going to do like health consulting or health coaching with me, and I give somebody one or two things and that solves the problem that person's having, we don't need to continue to do 6 months of coaching where I go deep into like, unless like, we're looking at blood work and there's other things that clearly need to be addressed on there. But for a lot of people, it's just, they want to feel better, and if you give them one or two things that kind of plug some of these big holes that a lot of people have and they feel great and they don't have all of these or any of these big issues like long COVID, or mold exposure, which I would say that's like, it's kind of half and half. You have like, in terms of my clients, it's like half of them are people that just have, nutrient deficiencies, like very basic nutrient deficiencies. And it's funny because some of them will say, I followed you for like the past 2-3 years and and they'll pay me for me to tell them the things that I've just been saying on my stories for the past 2-3 years. Like just take my magnesium and B complex and see how you feel,
Yeah.
And they're like, well, I paid you for a $250 consult and you're just telling me to take magnesium. And I'm like, well, are you taking it? Like, have you taken that? Have you tried it yet? And they're like, no. I'm like, well, start that first and just see how you feel, because I don't want you to waste even more money coaching with me when we could just do a few basic things. And that's about 50%. The other 50% are the people that are doing all that and they're still feeling like shit. And it's like they have long COVID, they have mold exposure and all of these other things that just complicate the whole fucking process. So,
yeah, it's funny because everyone on Instagram and social media, everyone loves to talk about nuance, which is where the fun is. But it's like, if you don't have the big rocks in check, you're not sleeping well. And that could be, your magnesium could help with sleep, so some of that too. But
for sure,
you're not walking daily, getting in some food that's not McDonald's. That's not sexy to talk about, but everything, you need those in place to get anything out of the magnesium.
Yeah, and that's probably something I should just put some type of disclaimer. I'd be like, do not work with me if you're not doing all that already. Because I don't want to just sit there and tell you not to eat crap and just to take a few supplements, I mean, some people need that though. I take that back. I guess some people do need that. They need somebody to talk to them one-on-one. Because I think sometimes when you're looking at stuff on Instagram, it may seem simple to you because you're the one putting the information out, but it can be very overwhelming for some people. They just need somebody to sit down and tell them what they've been hearing in a more like direct sort of setting, if that makes sense, I think.
Hormozy says something along those lines where it's like, give all your information out for free and then just sell the integration.
Right. Yeah. 100%. Yeah. The integration is probably, that's the biggest part because I think a lot of people now know what they need to do. They have all of the information. It's there. They've read it. They've seen it on Instagram. It's just putting the pieces together.
Absolutely. So one thing I did want to ask you is that, as we were talking about a little bit before, you kind of have a little bit of a, well, you'll disagree with me, but like a persona online. You kind of come across with a little bit of an attitude. And I was kind of expecting you to have that attitude in real life. And I was doing some research, listening to some podcasts. Seemed like a very nice, relaxed guy. How would you address that, I guess, or reconcile
Yeah, so
that?
we were talking, I before we started, just for people listening, I was like, wait, hold on. Like, before we get into this, like, let's record it because I think it's good. It's good for people to hear. Because it does tie into a lot of the social media stuff that you see online. But I was saying how I think, and it's hard to assess people's tone on Instagram sometimes, I think, because you're not listening to them speak. And so my whole thing is like, I am not going to blow smoke up your ass. I'm not going to tell you, I'm not going to lie to you, and I think some of that comes off, especially in certain settings where it's things that people might not want to hear. I think it can come off aggressively. It can sound like I'm being aggressive, and sometimes I am. That's another part of it, right? Where it's like on social media, people are going to, you have guys like, I think like maybe Lane Norton would be like the most extreme example with that, right? Where I think it's a little over the top, but I do get what he's doing. He's not there. There's two different ways that you can get people's attention, right? And everybody has something to sell. I have something to sell. You have something to sell. It's not a bad thing, right? It just depends on what it is that you're selling, right? And so all of this is ways to get people to listen to what you're saying, right? And I think that you can go one or two ways. You can legitimately lie and fearmonger people into believing certain things, that's one avenue. You can tell people just straight up lies, right? Which I think if you look at a lot of people in the carnivore and some of the ancestral community, you can tell that they don't really fully believe what it is that they're saying. They're selling you a persona, right? They're selling you on this idea that, yeah, all you need to do is eat liver, or all you need to do is just do these very, they're selling a very dogmatic approach, right? And so I think that you can talk and present information with a tone that still gets people to listen without selling people on polarized ideas, right? And I think even the whole debunking space is kind of polarized in the opposite direction, right? It's people on one side of the fence going after people on the other side of the fence, and
there's just a wall that says evidence-based on it.
Yes, but at the end of the day, they're both using the same. They're both using the same strategy to try to get people to listen to them, which is just being really polarizing, right? And so for me, I try to take a tone that I can get people to listen to the things that I'm saying without actually lying, right? Because I think on both sides of the fence, and maybe some people probably, they don't realize maybe they're lying, but that's essentially, it's a half truth. Anytime you're, really polarized to one side or the other, you're selling somebody a half truth. And I think that for me, I want to give people the full truth, but I still need to find ways to get people to listen, because that's the hardest part is when you're trying to tell people the truth, nobody listens, right? Because it's not something that people want to hear. If you can tell them the truth, but you can be a little aggressive in the way that you tell that truth, or you can be a little agitating without actually lying to people, it gets people to start listening, I mean, if you look at a lot of people like Squat U or something like that puts out fitness content, a lot of these people are not interested in debating with people online. They're generally good people trying to spread what they think is good information, but it's hard to get people to listen to that information that you have unless you're lying to them. You're just straight up selling a false dichotomy, right? Which is what a lot of people do in fitness, right? Never back squat or never let your knees over your toes or whatever it is, a lot of these people know that some of those things that they're telling people aren't true. They know that they're half truths, or that there's not nuance. There's not enough nuance in there, but nuance doesn't sell on Instagram, right? It's difficult to get people to listen to kind of a balanced perspective. And so if you're not selling people on something that's polarized, you kind of have to almost make your personality sort of polarizing, but not the information that you give people. Does that make sense? So you're not lying to people. You're just using kind of this tactic to grab people's attention and then sell them on the truth, right? It's kind of like a clickbait type of a thing, where you have a video. People do this on YouTube all the time, where they say the truth about insert this thing, and then the whole video, and you think, oh God, this video is going to be some it's going to be some garbage where somebody's just, shitting on this one thing. And then you listen to it, you're like, okay, this is actually kind of a balanced take, right? But they got you to listen to it,
Yeah. Where would you say, who would you compare yourself to in that light? If you could think of someone.
Well, dude, I think that's the crazy thing about the fitness space is when I think about the majority of people that are in fitness or nutrition, it's hard to find people that have those perspectives. personality wise, or the way I present information, I wouldn't compare myself to these people. But I think like Dr. Tyler is great. He has some extremely nuanced takes on genetics and things like that. Pedro, Thucydides. Yeah. I always forget. He's great. I think his content is amazing, and it's hard to find people. I mean, I think as I've dug deeper into nutrition and certain like niche health and fitness related topics, I found it really difficult to find people in this space that walk that line, right? That like have their opinions, but they're not like stuck to them, right? It's a malleable sort of a thing where they can walk this path. They have this thing that they do, whether it's genetics, whether it's fitness, but they understand that maybe there's more to the picture than just what they do or just their paradigm or their perspective. So I really respect those guys. I think they're great. There's others I'm sure I could mention. I can't think of them off the top of my head. But I found that very difficult. And that's why that's something that I try to emphasize in my own personal approach to fitness and nutrition. Because I think that's it's extremely lacking, and it's difficult to provide. It's a difficult thing to provide on social media because people don't want to listen to it. And when you do provide that nuance, it just ends up being like a wall of text, right? Mm-hmm. Which sometimes that's the way some of my posts are, some of them are. But I think if you can try to give that nuance and that context in a way that's not going to confuse people, that you're just giving them the facts on both sides of the fence. I think people from that, because they can start making better decisions. And they don't spend all of their time just bouncing from one extreme idea to the other. Because that's what you get with a lot of these people is like, well, this didn't work, so I'm going to bounce to the opposite side of the spectrum, and I'm going to do this over here. Carnivore, vegan, keto, whatever, right? And I think that you can take some of those perspectives and say, look, maybe a ketogenic diet might be really good for this person in this context, right? Like if you have a glioblastoma or like any type of a brain cancer, a keto diet is amazing. I mean, I know there's controversy around like the keto diet for cancer, but that is one thing. I mean, that we've seen some decent research on, and it's just a diet. It's not like you're giving somebody an experimental drug or something. So I think it's, a good option for some people in some circumstances, but then you could have like the opposite side of that perspective or that spectrum where you're doing like a metabolic approach, like a repeat type of a diet, which is great, probably better for just general health. So I think that sometimes some of these polarized perspectives on diet and nutrition can be useful in some contexts, but then you kind of have to like reel that back in and say, okay, this is where I'm at. I'm here, I have this issue. And then you can kind of look at all of these different options from the nuanced perspective, given the issues that you're dealing with, the specific things that you're trying to work on, as opposed to, well, the keto diet is just amazing for everybody, so I'm just going to do keto. Or the vegan diet is the way, so I'm just going to go vegan, right?
Well, it's as you said before, right? There are truths in these diets. They're just not the whole truth. Like there's reason people get benefits from carnivore, from vegan. But if you can take some of the nuances out of each and extract some of the principles, it's like, all right, this worked for me, this didn't work for me. Then you can construct a diet that will be almost guaranteed to work for you.
Yes, because you can find the differentiating factors within that diet, and you can sort of strip away all of the other things that aren't necessary, right? Like somebody that has SIBO might do really well on carnivore or keto for a little while because they're probably going to be reducing a lot of FODMAP foods, right? So you can modify that and say, well, I'm not going to go full keto or full vegan. I'm just going to take away FODMAP foods and see how I'm improving just based on that.
For sure. So how did you get into, so you have a very interesting perspective on all of this stuff. Pretty obviously diving deep into fitness, but as well as nutrition and health. What's your history and background getting into that?
It's I kind of grew up in a family where that was always really important. Like since I was maybe, I want to say like 7 or 8 years old. You know, I never ate like a perfect diet growing up, but there was always sort of the emphasis in my household, you know, when I grew up in my family, that was kind of an important thing, is like you ate well most of the time. You know, I mean, it wasn't, thinking back on it, it wasn't perfect by any stretch of the imagination in terms of like, you know, I still ate a lot of crap, you know, as most like kids do, you know, out of convenience and things like that. But I think that my parents, for the most part, tried to emphasize, at the very least, a passion for that. Like that was, I grew up with that idea that was something important, is that you needed to take care of yourself. You needed to eat well. And so, you know, my mom was into like a lot of alternative medicine practices and things like that. And so that kind of, I guess I sort of grew up with the idea in my head that, you know, there were answers out there that weren't conventional, you know. Obviously, there's a lot of things in the alternative medicine space that, you know, are kind of fringe and haven't been well studied. And it's kind of, you know, like homeopathy. You could say, well, you know, and this is the approach that a lot of people take, is they see something like homeopathy or they hear some of these ideas and it's like, well, that's so off-putting to me. And that the idea of that being possible is so outside of what I have conceptualized medicine or healthcare to be, that they just, anything related to health or wellness or anything alternative, right? They just it gets polarized and it gets thrown into this woo-woo sort of category, right? And people do this with all kinds of different things. And so I think it was good for me to grow up. There were a lot of things that I had to unlearn. You know, there were growing up that I believed were true about certain alternative practices. And I think at the very least, just the perspective that I grew up with helped me kind of build the system that I have now, which is really just, it's sort of a centrist standpoint, right? And I wouldn't even say it's centrist, because I don't really think there's a huge difference between alternative and conventional medicine. I think there's things that are proven, there's things that are unproven, there's things that are kind of in that gray area where we don't really know. And at the end of the day, you know, when you're trying to help somebody, your goal is to look at all available evidence, right? It's not to like put things in these arbitrary categories like, oh, that's alternative supplements, whatever it is, so I'm just not even going to look at that. It's actually taking all of these different things, these different practices, these different modalities, and looking at the actual evidence for those things, right? As opposed to just lumping things into these like distinct polarized categories like alternative or conventional medicine. And so I think growing up, that's how I kind of got into this, is that I already had sort of a balanced perspective on, look, conventional modern medicine is really great for some things. It's not great for other things, right? There's things that could be thrown in the alternative category that are really good for certain things. But if you get in a car accident and you're, you know, you need to get like your leg sewn back on, it's not going to help you, you know? And so those are like the extreme ends of the spectrum, but those also overlap, right? There's so many different things where even for like certain health issues where, you know, you're sick and you need to take an antibiotic, or, you know, there's nothing wrong with these things. We just need to be able to step back and sort of have this balanced perspective where we can look at all of these different things and see where they fall into different places on sort of like just the big picture, but then also like our picture, right? What we're dealing with. It was something that was valued in my household. I don't really have any background in nutrition or even exercise. Actually went to school for business marketing. So but for years before that, you know, people are going to cringe when they hear this, but I just did my own research. I know people hate that word, but I actually know how to do research. If you actually know, you understand the fundamentals of how to read research, you can absolutely do your own research, right? I think this like elitist perspective that science is only for the academic elite or the credentialed is absolutely horrendous. And like, if you want people to read science, teach them how to do science, right? That's all of these people are just, I guess, attacking these people. You have these people that will say things like, especially in the alternative health community, they're saying things that maybe don't have a lot of good evidence because they don't know how to read research. But then these people are just getting attacked instead of actually being like, hey, well, like, let's actually teach this person how to read research, right? And that's my big thing is like, I like to teach people when I share information. I don't like to just give people information itself. I like to teach them how to think about the information that they're reading or they're looking at, right? So that's where like philosophy and logic and things like that are kind of really, I guess, they're not emphasized really at all anymore, are super important. So that's kind of another big thing that I do is not just giving people information, but also giving people the correct perspectives on how to look at information itself. And I think that perspective, it sometimes it's difficult. I feel like when I got into fitness, I already sort of had that. It was almost sort of an intuitive thing when I look at certain information or I'm thinking about, a certain topic. That's always been sort of first nature for me is looking at information that way and being able to see the big picture. So there wasn't anything that I really did to teach myself that. I think I just trusted my own intuition. And that's, I think, another thing that's gotten really beat out of people is their ability to actually trust. Of course, you need studies. Of course, you need objective ways to look at information. But I think some of these knee-jerk reactions to certain things that people have just gotten beat out of them through schooling and certain things. And some of those intuitive proclivities that people have for assessing information, I think, can also be looked at from an analytical perspective. That's what logic and philosophy is, right? It's taking these deep sort of intuitive ideas that we have about the world and the things that are going on around us, and it's kind of giving it like an intellectual backbone. It's saying, look, this is this logical fallacy. This is this idea. And then you think about it and you're like, okay, like that makes sense, right? Like I've thought about stuff like that in my own head, right? Especially like when you're a kid, like you think about like paradoxes and things, and like, a lot of games and things that kids talk about are centered around some of these ideas, and they don't even realize it. And so I think trusting some of those instincts that we have to look at information in particular ways can be really important, because then that kind of gives you the impetus to start going down some of these rabbit holes in your own mind, right? You can take certain ideas and certain information and certain things that you think about, and then you can get on Instagram and you can say, okay, look, this idea confirms this intuitive understanding that I had about this thing, and here's the reason why, right? It's because this is, this philosophical concept, right? This thing matches that idea that I've, kind of had in my head. And so I think, people are always, asking the question, like, how do I learn more about how to learn, right? Because that's really, epistemology and philosophy, that's really the questions that we're asking. And how do I look at information differently and better? And I think the first step is just to trust your knee-jerk reactions to certain things, right? Because that is sort of this abstract intelligence or this this intelligence that we have that's sort of, unconscious, right?
It's innate.
Yes, exactly. And there's a science to that as well. This can also be broken down and looked at objectively, but I think trusting some of those gut instincts, a good example that I like to give people is like, when somebody knows that it's about to rain, like you have this weird feeling, even if the sky looks, whatever. And I think that when you start like looking at some of these instincts that people have, whether it's like about another person, you know, like they're looking at somebody else and like, I know that's a bad person, right? And then we start asking these questions like, why do people feel that way, right? And then you can actually get into like a lot of really interesting theoretical mechanisms for how that happens, right? Like you're observing body language, but you don't really realize it because it's not your forebrain. It's more of this like reflexive hindbrain or like stress sort of response where it's not an aware thing. You're picking up on all of this information that you're not even aware of. And I think even in intellectual pursuits, we know this to be true. You know, like Einstein, I think had, you know, he a lot of his ideas about physics and things came from, I remember there was a story like he was on a train and he was just like looking out the window or something. And it just like, he like saw some type of like vision or something where it's like it intellectually, it all of a sudden just made sense to him. It was like he got like a download or something, right? So it wasn't this process where he had to, I mean, you know, obviously it's Einstein, so he did a lot of this too, but I think some of these really big ideas that people get, it kind of just comes to them. It's not like they have to sit there and work it out on paper. That's also a thing. That's also a component of it. But I think that, you know, sometimes when you have some of these big breakthroughs, some of these big ideas, a lot of them come to people in these very odd, almost like spiritual sort of like ways, if that makes sense.
Yeah. Have you dug into Ray Peat a decent amount?
Who? Say that again?
Ray Peat.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. He got me really into, I mean, I love all of his work, but he really put forward how important it is to dig into art and philosophy and all these things that are used to be considered part of science and part of the scientific process. But now it's kind of like extraneous. Like it's like you don't need to have any ideas or these philosophical thoughts. And one of the things I tweeted a while back, I think it's really important, but I made it into kind of a tongue twister. It's like, how can you trust the thoughts of a man who has not thought about how he thinks? You know?
Exactly. Yeah. Yeah. Because I mean, you have a lot of these things are very, they're familiar to people. And that's the great thing. People will also sort of shit on people who intellectualize things. And I think that's wrong because intellectualizing something gives people the explanation for things that they trusted in their own bodies at one point, but maybe lost, right? And so you have people that go through school and they go through this whole process of becoming more objective in the way that they look at information, potentially, at least in like that narrow domain or that narrow way. And I think that when you can sort of have to take people back to that gut sort of instinct that they used to possess. But sometimes you need to use this intellectual sort of route to get people there, if that makes sense, right? And then when you can like start explaining some of these things to people, some of these abstract concepts using these concrete names and definitions for things, then it's like a light bulb goes off in some people's head where they're like, oh yeah, that makes sense to me. I remember thinking about that when I did this. And that was like, it's almost like a deja vu, like a fleeting sort of thought that they had in their mind, or, you know, they remember. I think a lot of this stuff happens to people when they daydream too. You know, they have these ideas and these thoughts about the world that are just very instinctive. And then a lot of that gets beaten out of people, and you have to like reteach people how to think about that, if that makes sense. You have to reteach
absolutely.
people how to think about what they were previously thinking about.
Well, it's like, and that's another thing Pete talks about a lot. It's like, if you have been programmed to think that all of your cravings are your body trying to trick you into getting fat, obese, and unhappy, you're going to think that everything that your body is telling you is wrong. So, but then you can reconcile this with the idea that, you know, sugar might be good for you in some contexts at least, but our body might not have the ability to differentiate between the Pop-Tart and the orange that's sitting on your counter. Like, it just knows there's sugar in both of those. So I might crave the Pop-Tart, but it's like recognizing that your body is probably has some innate intuition and some innate intelligence, and then you can branch off that and, breed your own intuition over time.
Yeah, 100%. Yeah, that's where I think sometimes you have to ask these regional questions about certain things before you can even get to the big picture, right? Because the big picture might be my body's asking for sugar, but I got a Pop-Tart and I got some fruit in front of me, right? So yeah, the big picture is, okay, maybe I'm craving sugar, so I need to eat some sugar. But then you get into the weeds of like, okay, well, my body, this is a very primitive thing. My body doesn't know the difference between sugar at a Pop-Tart, like you said, and sugar at fruit, because now they're very different things, right? There's still the sugar in it, but it's got all this other shit in it too.
Yeah.
And so the small picture perspective is like, okay, well, like, let's actually like look at what's in the Pop-Tart and like, let's study some of these other ingredients, some of this other crap that's in there, right? And like, let's see if that's good for us first, right? Because that's the problem with only looking at things from this like big picture perspective, is like you miss out on a lot of things because there's all of these minor details that also matter, right? And so it's not just, I think that's really the big picture. People mistake the big picture for some of these abstract concepts, but the true definition of the big picture is the integration of things that people might consider the small picture with some of these bigger picture abstract kind of frameworks. And I like that you mentioned some of that work that Pete did, because I was reading his book, and this is a book that I think he wrote in the 70s or the 80s, so it's pretty old.
Generative energy,
which is insane. The book is called what is it called?
PMS to menopause? Mind and tissue.
No.
Or tissue and body?
Mind and tissue.
Yeah.
I think that's what it's called. I mean, dude, that thing is dense, bro. I mean, you really got to sit there and like, you got to read. Sometimes whenever I read that book, I would read 3 to 4 pages of it a day, or 3 to 4 pages of it every couple of days. And I would just sit there and like think about what I read. Cause it's just, there's so many implications to it. Like some of his ideas about the, exploratory reflex, like this idea that like our most innate sort of driver is this novelty seeking experience where we're constantly like learning about things. We're learning about our own self through the external world, and how that's kind of like one of the primary drivers. And this is my take on it. This is my take on some of the stuff that I read. That like, that you see people in old age that are doing really well. A lot of the time, like you look at some of these people that are doing really well, and they're doing all of these things, right? Like they're gardening, or they're still, like I knew this lady, we were talking, my grandfather recently passed away. And
sorry to hear that.
Thanks, man. Yeah. At his funeral, we were talking to my grandma, and she was saying how they had this friend that died at 100 and I think she was 110. And up until she was 100, she was like skiing and like doing all these things. And so I think sometimes maybe there's sort of this top down and like bottoms up way that we can sort of look at longevity, where yes, these actual habits that we have feed into adapt. Like you need to lift weights to strengthen your muscles, or you need to eat this certain way to do this for your biology. But then there's also sort of this other perspective, this sort of top down, I guess you could say, perspective, where you could say maybe it's not so much about the activities that we're doing. I think it's both, but you could say, this is another perspective. You could say maybe it's not so much about the activities that we're doing, but it's our like constitution, like our personality, like the things that are driving those activities, right? Why does somebody that's 100 years old want to still work and want to still do these things, right? Because they have this innate desire that I think is getting beat out of a lot of people to explore or to tinker with things. And I think that like you could almost look at like longevity from that sort of aspect, where it's not even so much about the thing that you're doing. Because people will hear that, they're like, oh, I need to go ski for longevity. And it's like, no, you need to figure out why you still want to ski, because that's a good thing, right? People that have like this this ADD or this proclivity to constantly like tinker with things or like build things or explore certain things, you also kind of get into this mindset or this frame of like it sort of like takes you out of this linear view of time where, you know, like you go through a boring day where you're just doing the same shit and it just feels like eternity, right? I think there could even be this biological, and this is I'm not saying Ray Peter said this. This is my idea of it, and maybe he did say this. I don't know, but I think you could almost look at health and longevity kind of through this this perspective where, you know, when you take yourself out of this like linear view of time where just everything's boring and everything's just dragging on, and you're doing these things to pull yourself out of boredom, right? You know, it's like you find a task that you really love doing, and then you look at the clock and you're like, oh shit, I forgot to eat today because I've just been doing this one thing this whole time and I've been so into it. In a way, I think you could kind of view that as like a mechanism maybe where, you know, like Joe Dispenza talks about things like this too, where, you know, you have things that you really enjoy, or you're just really like, you have this work that's so purposeful that just, it's like it takes your biology almost out of this like, I don't even know how to describe what I'm saying. It takes you out of this like normal day-to-day operating pattern that most people are kind of
going on auto mode.
Yes,
you know?
Exactly. Yes, 100%. You're not. Yeah, you're very focused on something, and I think that has massive implications for biology and for the way that people feel, because that's very similar to what we get out of good social situations. You know, we know that that's like one of the biggest things that we're seeing with all these blue zones. People are like, oh, it's diet, it's this, it's that, and it's like, I think it's probably the fact that like they just have really good like social. They're just in these like great environments, you know?
Absolutely. I made a post saying the exact same thing. And I also said they also have family and live near their family. So they have a purpose. Like every person that lives past 100, you know, usually they're smoking cigarettes or something, but they also work and have family nearby. Like they love their life.
Yeah. Yeah. For people that maybe are listening to this that are like bored. Well, I think if they're listening to this, they're probably not bored. But if They're just like, oh, this is so much just intellectual, like, you know, just mental masturbation to describe just something simple. It's like, yeah, I mean, at the simplest explanation is like, you need to have a purpose. You need to have some type of driver. And then I think that can take a lot of different forms, you know, with like work and family and different things. So that was way off of a tangent that I think we were talking about Ray Pete before that. I can't remember, but, I think that some of his work,
it's a good tangent.
Some of the things that he talks about, he has implicated that in his work.
Here's a quote that's from him, actually. I have, in 2019, I asked Ray, what are your thoughts on meaningful activity and what is the meaning of life? He said, quote, it's a matter of degree and the amount of satisfaction can depend on how much of one's experience is related to the activity. For example, making something has meaning in itself, but making it for someone who needs it more is more meaningful. Walking on a treadmill for exercise has the meaning that you think it is good for your health, but walking to see new places and people adds meaning to it. Life in general is more meaningful when each action can be seen to be useful for everyone.
Yeah, and I think that could go into a huge rabbit hole or tangent about kind of how we've fractioned a lot of the things that we do in society, like you know, fitness is in a gym, it's in an air-conditioned gym on a treadmill. Right? Where it used to just be you would go outside and garden and like, you know, whatever. And I don't think, I'm also very hesitant to be the person that's like, oh, we need to go ahead and like throw out fitness, right? It's like, and we just need to return back to this way that we were doing things before. And I don't think that's the answer either, because the gym kind of, it gives us something that we didn't have previously, right? It's sort of adding back what we no longer get, right? Like you could say, well, I work a 9-to-5 job and I can't do all of the things that I would normally get intrinsically in a manual labor job. And so I have to go to the gym, right? Or you could even look at it from the perspective of like an athlete. I think the most evolved perspective on training and nutrition is we figure out some type of way to add back all of the things that we're missing, right? Like the grounding, like we used to be grounded all the time. We used to breathe good air, right? It's finding technological ways to add those things back, right? Like you get a home air filter system to clean your air so you're breathing good air. Maybe you sleep on a Magnetico sleep pad or something, so you're getting some of the Earth's magnetic field back. Maybe you're viewing the sun every morning, and then you're cutting blue light up at night and you have like the red lights on or something. I think that those are ways that we can sort of like return back to some of our roots in a sense. But then I think the ultimate perspective isn't just to return back to the way that things were, because I think there's also limitations in that. People got sick, right? Modern medicine has done when penicillin came around, right? That was magic for people that, were getting these infections, right? People died of the plague, and they were grounded all the time, right?
Yeah.
And so I think this idea that like, when people over romanticize some of these ideas about our ancestors, they're ignoring the fact that there were a lot of really shitty things that went on as well, right? And so I think the evolved perspective is, yes, let's add back in all of these things that were good, that did these things for us that now we're lacking in, right? Like, I'm almost positive there are certain diseases that are related to EMF exposure, right? I mean, that's something that we don't have a lot of conclusive evidence on, but it's starting to look that way, right? And so we can add back things that sort of help our bodies adapt to these new stressors that we have, but then we can intelligently integrate that with things like modern medicine, right? And things like targeted supplementation, things like biohacks that, again, that's another polarized thing where you have a lot of people in the ancestral community that are like, fuck biohacks. You don't need any of that. You just need to get grounded. And it's like, need is a very interesting word, because I just like to look at like what's useful. I don't like to tell people what they need. I just say this could be useful for you given this, right? And so it's like, it's kind of difficult to return to nature when you work a 9 to 5 and you're under fluorescent lights, right? You got to do these things to kind of mitigate the damage, right? Because our bodies are very adaptable. We just haven't hyper novelty, all of these hyper novel things like AI and technology and blue light and all of these things, I think can really negatively influence our health, not because our body can't adapt to them at some point in time, but because we don't have things are changing too fast in our environment for our bodies to adapt, right? And so we need some of these things to kind of mitigate that damage, to kind of smooth that damage out. And so that's biohacks, that's wearing blue light blocking, that's all these things that people make fun of, right? Yeah. So there's that perspective. And then I think the ultimate standpoint is to say, maybe now, like with new laws and new regulations, I mean, it's going to definitely be there's a lot of change that needs to happen, right? For us to like, I think the world has to get really, really bad before like lawmakers and things begin to start saying, well, we're going to put regulations on like EMF exposure and like certain health hazards and whatnot. But I think that, that's the ultimate like evolved perspective, is through our own choices and our own habits and through, laws that get changed over the course of years, is that we can return back to some of those things that we did in the past that were really good for us, right? Like, you could have regulations where, instead of blue lights in the house, right, you have like a different type of bulb that like is the standard now, where it's not emitting a ton of blue light, but the light is maybe closer to like full UV or full, sun exposure, basically. It's closer to those spectrums, right? You could have all of these different things that I think could move the needle for people kind of back towards, the habits that we would have, the habits and the lifestyle that we would have had 100, 200 years ago. And then you can start also solving these problems that can be solved by those things, right? Because back in the day, people got sick. There were all of these problems that people had that are not going to be solved by diet, grounding, and, taking essential oils, right?
I mean, look at like Civil War, right? Most people died of infection, not from actual gunshots or anything like that. Like, just tell
exactly.
them to go ground their half of their arm in the dirt. Like, that'll work.
Yeah, and I even think you could apply that to fitness too, where you could say, yes, we have lives now where we're not sitting all day. We're able to like work better jobs, or we're able to do better things where you can get up and we can move, and we can integrate fitness with things that we also enjoy. But then I think we can also have the perspective that, like maybe we can go into the gym and we can do certain forms of strength training that optimize our bodies for specific things in ways that we still wouldn't have gotten in nature, right? Because that's the great thing about things like physical therapy is like, I'm almost positive that people 2, 3, 4, 1,000 years ago, however far back you want to go, had pain from musculoskeletal injuries. I have no doubt. I have no doubt that they got fucked up, chasing somebody or fighting somebody or hunting or whatever it was that they were doing. I think the difference between the pain that they probably had and the pain that we have now is most people have chronic pain from doing things that are very repetitive. They probably had like legitimate injuries and things to their bodies. And so that's where I think you can take some of these perspectives and say, we don't need to throw away modern fitness and modern nutrition and modern medicine. We can take all of these things, and now that we're sort of back at baseline, this is like our upgrade, right? It's like, just think of everything that we were doing prior to the modern world as like just baseline. It wasn't good, it wasn't bad. It was the way things worked. People died. We didn't have certain diseases back then because of certain things, but we also don't have certain diseases now that we had back then because of modern medicine. And so I think you can take that as the baseline and say, now let's just upgrade the human being, right? We have the baseline, we have the foundation in check. Now let's solve all of these problems that we never would have been able to solve 200-300 years ago because we didn't have the technology, right? Like gene mutations and, I think gene therapy is really promising. That's one good example. There's a lot of kinks that need to be worked out before we can give people that, I think, safely and in good faith. But that's another, the idea of gene therapy is insane. It's right now it's been polarized because of, the thing that people got and, there's stuff around that and the way that gene therapy historically went in the past. But I think that's, when you think about some of these things that modern medicine has to offer, like gene therapy or some of these very targeted, like even regeneration, like some of the things that Becker was working on, some of the things that some of these guys like Adil Khan and the stem cell research that they're doing, we may be able to regenerate limbs and organs here in the next 8 to 10 years, right? You're not going to get that from grounding, right? If you got your leg chopped off 400 years ago, you were fucked. If you get your leg chopped off now, I think it's possible that we can say in 10 to 20 years, there may be a solution to that. We may find, if you look at Michael Levin's work and some of the things that he's doing with bioelectricity, it's like we're so close to cracking the code on some of these things. It just gets so difficult because nobody seems to have this cohesive perspective where we can integrate this new tech with because everybody thinks that tech is evil now and there's some type of big looming side effect to it, right? Yeah. And I think that's just because we haven't been careful with the way that we've been looking at tech, because we haven't looked at it from the perspective of maybe like our biologically adapted necessities, if that makes sense.
Yeah. It's almost like how we can, as you said, kind of using technology to return to our baseline and, fill in the gaps between what we have with modern technology and what we use traditionally.
Yes. Yeah. I think that's the ultimate big picture.
Yeah. It's interesting. So one of the things I did want to ask you, you've been diving into, or I don't know if you've been diving into, but you have a very perspective, very grounded in logic, it seems like. What would be your advice for someone navigating, the two polarizing sides that seem to be with everything today and using logic potentially to help navigate themselves around the world, but also, in the learning process, how to go about research for themselves?
Yeah, I think if it's something that doesn't come naturally to you, I think just taking a basic course on logic and philosophy would be super helpful. And it's not about memorizing names and terms and things. You don't need to sit there and know what a sunk cost fallacy is or a false dichotomy right off the bat. So I think a lot of people are turned off from it because it seems like a daunting, like they need to have like this extremely high IQ to understand these concepts. But again, I think a lot of this is intuitive for so many people. They just need to be reminded of it. That's really, I think, all it is like if you just gave somebody a book that outlined all of the things that they intuitively know and you just gave it a name, all of a sudden, I think people would be able to connect so many different pieces of information in a second. It would be like, holy shit, this is that thing that I remember thinking about when I was a kid, but I always thought I was stupid for thinking it. Now I'm reading this book written by this smart person that's saying there's actually a name for that thing, right? Like I recently learned what the Stockdale paradox was. I just talk about it all the time now because it gave a name to something that I've been describing for a long time.
Can you explain the Stockdale paradox?
Yeah. So I think that the basic idea is that like when you're approaching information or you're approaching decision making, there's sort of two perspectives, right? There's the and this is not necessarily the way things have to be, but this is sort of the polarized way that most people approach information. You have people that you either ignore the information, like I'll put it this way, and this is not something that Joe Dispenza has ever said, but if you look at a lot of the people that do Joe Dispenza's work, there's people that fall into the trap of what's in some communities, they call it like spiritual bypassing, where instead of like actually taking a look at yourself and being very honest with yourself or being very honest about the world and the things that are going on in the world, like being just objectively really honest, you just ignore it. And you kind of almost develop this like pathological positivity, right? Where you can say, look, okay, based on like what we've seen at these events or like some of Joe Dispenza's work, like let's say like somebody like beat cancer because they like change their mindset, right? Like, cause that's a big part of disease, right? We know this is what we were talking about with the entire, the blue zones and whatnot. It's all tied together, right? So you could say, well, like longevity and disease is really impacted by how you think, right? And so people will ignore things that are bad because they're afraid that it's going to impact the way that they think. It's going to impact their health because they're like hyper aware and hyper worried about certain things, which is true. There's 100% truth to that. Like if you look at people that are like OCD and like health or orthorexic, that's entirely a real thing. You can definitely be so worried about doing all the right things that you sabotage your health because of that. The problem is the entire idea behind changing the way you think is acknowledging that there's an issue in the way that you were thinking before, right? You have to recognize or acknowledge that something is an issue before you can make actual changes that allow you to get to that place where you can actualize the benefits of like an evolved perspective on something, right? And so I think even with like his work, and he's said this before, he's like, Joe Dispenza will talk about like, okay, well, look, yes, this is what you need to do. This is the perspective that you need to have, but that doesn't mean that you ignore problems in your own life. That doesn't mean that you don't change your diet. That doesn't mean that you don't look at things and start making better decisions about your health, right? And in order to do that, you have to have information, right? Information about what's good and what's bad. And so the ultimate perspective is that, yes, we can like take this magnifying glass and start looking at all of the things that are bad. There's fluoride in the water, there's heavy metals, you're being exposed to EMFs. These are all, you could make a list of all these things that are bad, right? If you stay stuck in searching for information to find all of the things that are bad instead of trying to find that information so that you can make better decisions, right? Then you're gonna fall into orthorexia, right? And so I think we can have this perspective where we can be very honest about the problems that are in the world without worrying about the problems that are in the world. Because the ultimate goal of making these decisions is making decisions so that we can kind of have the peace of mind that I've taken care of these things, right? If your house is on fire, right, it's hard to get to the place where you can have this evolved higher perspective on life and being optimistic and things like that when your house is on fire. You got to put the fire out first, right? And so I think that, when we look at sort of the small picture in nutrition and we focus on a lot of these details and the things that we can do to improve our nutrition, and we get really granular with the details, that's one part of the picture. So the Stockdale paradox, to get to that, is this idea that we need both of those things, right? We need to have this evolved perspective on things that, regardless of how daunting all of these issues are that we're facing, we have to have faith that we're going to be able to figure that out, right? Because that in of itself is a component of solving the issue in of itself, right? Like changing the way you think, in terms of you have depression or you have anxiety or you have some chronic health issue. That is part of the answer. But then the other perspective is, yes, we need to have that hope that we're going to prevail through the difficulties in our life. But in order to do that, we also have to address the reality of our situation, that some things are really bad. We got to do something about it, right? And that is the biggest issue that I see currently in health and fitness, is nobody is marrying those two. You have people in the evidence-based community that are just ignoring all of these potential things that could be bad for us. And they're saying, well, we don't have any evidence that it's actually harmful, blah, blah, blah. You're just fear-mongering people by telling them to worry about these things. And it's like, no, that's not, you have to, they don't actually believe this, right? Because then they'll talk about climate change. Then they'll go on Instagram and talk about climate change for 2 hours. And it's like, how is talking about climate change any different than talking about the fact that, maybe the fertilizer that we're putting on our food is not only destroying the environment, but also our bodies, right? Because the ecosystem is really we're part of the ecosystem. So if you want to talk about the environment, you can't leave human health out of that as well, because it's a dynamic, complex system as well. So I think that a lot of these things these perspectives that people have on certain things, I don't really think that they truly believe some of the underlying paradigms about fear-mongering or whatever it is. They just don't like the information itself.
Mm-hmm. So it's almost like blind hope versus blind pessimism.
Exactly. Yeah, 100%.
Interesting. Yeah, that's fascinating perspective. I think logic's something I would really like to dive into, because when you're going through, you hear people debate Lane or whatever, Ben Shapiro, whoever it is. You sometimes can't recognize. You're just oh, that's a good point. I don't know how I would respond to that. And if you can understand that they might be speaking in a paradox or some kind of logical fallacy, we're well, their whole way of thinking is wrong. And I don't disagree with what they're saying. It's just they have a flawed perspective on the thing entirely.
Oh yeah, and I think maybe the best example of this, I don't know if it's the best example, because I think there's a lot of people that probably aren't going to be able to accept that it's the truth. But if you look at politics, or you take conservative versus Democrat, right? The entire reason that there's two political parties is because you kind of need this tug of war between these different perspectives, right? Those two polarized perspectives, when they're in balance, the solution that comes out of that is usually kind of something in the middle, right? Unless you're a legitimate, just a full-blown communist country or something, right? That's I would say that's the pathological example of an extreme idea taken to a destructive end, right? Mm-hmm. Whereas when you have these two balancing forces, you can say, well, yes, I believe that, people need to be able to work for themselves, and we need elements of capitalism so that we can innovate, but then we also need elements of like government oversight so that we don't completely fuck ourselves over with like new technology and things, right? Like AI. Because if you look at a lot of the conservatives that are talking about AI now, it's like, okay, well, so you do want some government oversight in this area, right? And then you have people that are like super, super against government oversight in other areas, like in nutrition and certain things. But it's like, you have to have that to some extent. Otherwise, you're going to get yourself into a real big fucking problem, right? You could say, well, okay, like if AI takes over all of our jobs, you know, people, it'll fix itself, right? The new jobs will come out of that, right? And it's like, yeah, that's true. But what about in that 10 to 20 year lag time, right? Things are going to be really, really, really shitty during that period of during that transition. And so you need some of these laws and constraints and regulations to make that more smooth, right? You could make the same argument for, I guess you could say like welfare programs and things and taxes, right? There's no doubt that we need programs for people that are suffering and that can't afford to eat, right? But then you have, you know, obviously that can get out of hand where you have people that are just like living off the government, right? There's this tug of war and this balance and pull between a lot of these ideas. And so I think that politics is a really good way to look at that. If you're willing to accept the fact that, like, you know, everything on your side of the fence might not be the entire picture, right? But that's what we have two parties, right? We have sort of this, I would look at like a conservative paradigm as sort of like a kind of like I would compare it to like the ancestral sort of thing. Like, this is our baseline foundation, right? We have people, we have a good system set up to where we can, people can work for themselves and people can make money. But then we also have like the modern medicine component, which is like the governmental constraints and the like micro tuning of the system when shit hits the fan. And we can't solve that with this like larger foundational sort of paradigm, if that makes sense.
Yeah. Well, this is obviously very tangential, but like the foundation of the political spectrum is, right, equality versus order. And, you know, you don't want to be purely equality because that's communism. And typically when you get communism, you also get the best of both worlds where you get fascism, which is the end of order. So you want to be somewhere in the middle where you want some equality. You don't want, like, you know, monopolies and all that stuff. And you want some order as well. So you don't have, you know, what was that movie where they're just like breaking into people's houses? The Purge.
Oh, The Purge. Yeah. That's like anarchy almost. Yeah.
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 So going off of that, what would you, if you want to get into research, you have, you know, a young kid, 18 years old, it's like saying, Grant, I want to start researching. I want to develop my own perspective on these things. What would be your advice there?
Like, just as far as like how to read research and things like that? Or
I guess how to read research, but also like what to read in terms of, you know, should you go straight to PubMed or, you know, try and read some of Joe Dispenza's work or Ray Peat, someone like that?
Yeah, man, it's so hard to say sometimes because it's like, I think sometimes you need that big picture, that foundation to be able to understand what information you need to be reading and looking into, because there's a lot of things that seem and sound very credible. And maybe you may like let's just say you have a large randomized controlled trial showing that something like if take fitness is a really good example where a lot of the things that we've seen recently in fitness, like they recently found that, I think I could be butchering the statistics, but I think over 70 to 80% of the meta-analysis in strength and conditioning, they found like massive statistical errors in a lot of these papers, right? So you could say, well, it's a meta-analysis, right? This is the highest level of evidence, right? And sure, there's issues with metas, right? Like, you know, you could take, it depends on who's making the inclusion criteria in a meta-analysis, right? I'm sure that could be biased, right? But even if there's bias, right, we can say, well, the information and the studies that they did pull from, we can say this conclusively about all of that information that they did look at, right? Regardless of whether they're biased and they're not considering evidence over here. But, you know, when it gets to like some of these statistical, like Harvard there was this big Harvard scandal where they found that like, I guess one of the researchers, it was like a cancer stem cell study where they like had taken pictures from like websites that sell like stem cell cultures. It was like the little description picture for the product. And they like included that in their paper just so they could like find an image of stem cells. And it's like, dude, that was supposed to be something that you like actually took under a microscope, right? That's not even like, that image has nothing to do with your study, right? But it takes people digging through some of these studies to find out that that was like, forged, basically. It was, you plagiarized it. So it's sometimes I think it's hard. You can't like trust even some of these, large scale randomized controlled trials in some instances, or even, just some of this research that we're seeing coming out of prestigious schools. So I think that like, again, the first step in understanding research is understanding philosophy, because you can look at that research and based on like prior understanding of, and that goes into also like having a foundational understanding of the subjects that you want to study, like biology and physics and things. And you can say, well, okay, this sounds really interesting, but this doesn't really like, there's components of this that doesn't really align with how I understand the world or this this thing in this context. It doesn't align with what I understand about fitness or nutrition. Like a really good example would be like the hip thrust studies that came out, where they said, oh, we did this study showing that hip thrusts improve sprint speed, right? And so now everybody's like trying to do hip thrust, or I'm sorry, the study was on hip thrust versus squats, that hip thrust increased sprint performance better than squats. And you could look at that and say, okay, I mean, but does that like, what if the study was like 30 weeks long, right? Is it still going to show the same thing, right? Because we know about, as far as length tension relationships, like when you're doing a squat, you're going to take the glutes to a longer range of motion, right? And a muscle that's trained through its full range of motion is going to be healthier and stronger, right? That's kind of like our core foundation. And so people can take some of these studies and say, oh, we don't need to squat. We're just going to hip thrust because the studies show that hip thrusts are better. And it's like, well, the study's not showing that hip thrusts are better outright. It's just showing that maybe with this population in this select circumstance, it did this. But now let's extrapolate that out to like a year. Maybe now all you've done is hip thrust, but you haven't trained your glute in like a lengthened position under load. And so now you could say, well, that's a problem because now we haven't really developed the muscle fully to handle what it's capable of, right? We've sort of only focused on like the shortened contraction, right? We've ignored the lengthened contraction, and now we're in a point where like maybe we could have made more progress if we just did both, right? We just addressed both ends of the spectrum, even though we didn't see this immediate benefit with the squats, right? Because maybe with a squat, you accumulate more fatigue, and fatigue temporarily makes your sprinting performance worse, but maybe in the long run, it does all of these other things for you, right? And that's just one example, but I think that like being able to like just take like what we know and apply that to research is really important, because there's a lot of things that we can find in research that can validate some biased perspective that we have if we don't have that good underlying perspective. Like with strength and conditioning, that's the foundation, right? You learn about different types of muscle contractions, and you learn about different ways to train that are all important. And so anybody that really understands general physical preparedness would never say that a hip thrust is better than a squat at improving sprinting speed. Nobody would ever say that outright. There's just transient fluctuations and how certain things impact the body. And so, you have a new stimulus that you've never used before, and maybe that's part of the reason why you adapted the way you did. So there's all of these different things that I think are really foundational to research. And I think the biggest, to be honest, I wouldn't even tell people if they're into strength and conditioning to go out and just read a bunch of research. I would just say, hey, crack open a physiology, an anatomy textbook, and just start learning that stuff. Because once you learn that, a lot of the research makes a whole lot more sense, you know.
Or
you
doesn't.
have people, or it doesn't, yeah. Because you're looking at it now and you're like, why would I focus on it? Or why would I, you know, like people talk about like doing like lengthened partials now, where you're just training the lengthened portion of a muscle because, you know, well, that's the most important part for hypertrophy. And it's like, well, you're ignoring all of these other potential contributing factors like, you know, training in ranges of motion for like, to drive, you know, lactate responses or metabolic responses to training, because it's easier to accumulate metabolic fatigue if you're doing like a shortened range of motion or something like that. Or you could have a study saying that you need to do like a lat biased row to build your lats. And it's like, okay, that's great. But at some point you're going to adapt to that. And maybe you switch to a wide grip lat pull down. And because that allows you to use more weight than the single arm, maybe you end up growing more from that temporarily, you know? There's so many different factors and things that tie into the goal that you want, that you can't just hyper focus on this one thing because the research says that this is best for that goal. You can say, okay, well, we know you can take broader conclusions and you can integrate them into things that you already know about fitness and nutrition, right? You could say, well, we know lengthened partials are good for muscle growth because taking a muscle through its full range of motion is good for hypertrophy. So obviously, like a lengthened partial is really going to emphasize that stretch, and it's going to emphasize that metabolic damage, right? And so you can take that conclusion there and you can say, okay, maybe most of my training is going to be just normal training. I might put some lengthened partials in there, and then maybe like 20 to 30% of my training is focused on doing like end range contractions, right? Because we know that maybe that's not the most ideal thing for muscle growth. So we're going to focus the majority of our efforts on training through full ranges of motion or taking the muscle, you know, doing some lengthened partials or something. That's kind of our meat and potatoes, because we know this about how muscles grow. And then we can also add in things that maybe we don't have a lot of good research for, like lengthened, like doing contractions in short range of motion. Because, you know, maybe we can accumulate more metabolic fatigue, or maybe even we're just making the joint stronger, right? Because instead of, you know, like let's say we're trying to train a full range of motion, if you can't get full external rotation, it's really hard to get a good contraction here if you're stuck here, right? It's like you're trying to go somewhere that you can't go because you don't have full range of motion. So then there's this other perspective where it's like, well, maybe we're just talking about joint health and integrity. And so maybe that plays into our ability to build muscle, because we're focusing on just being able to get our body into good positions to even be able to train through a full range of motion, right? If we're stuck in a position where we don't have good external rotation, or we don't have good hip internal rotation into some of those end ranges, maybe that limits our ability to actually get into some of those lengthened positions. And so that's why you can't just look at research showing that one thing is good or one thing is best, because there's all of these other things, these foundational things that tie into supporting that thing, and making that effective for people. Yeah.
A perfect example of this, at least in my head, is the study that came out with volume, like 52 sets is better for muscle growth. So it's basically like
perfect
as many
example.
sets as you can. And, you know, you take that, you're like, all right, well, I guess I'm never leaving the gym. I'm going to sleep there, wake up in the middle of the night, do some bicep curls. But then I was talking to Cody Moxley, who's from N1, and he said, well, you could take a different perspective on that and say that we have a max recoverable volume that we can do. And that could be distributed across all of the exercises. So then it's not just this abstract 52 sets for biceps. It's like, okay, there's a limit to how much we can do and progress on, not just like the abstract of like, I took this study for its word, I need to do 52 sets of everything.
Yep. There's so much good information in some of those extreme studies, because people say, oh, that research is worthless, right? Like that, nobody can do that, blah, blah. And it's like, but that's giving you, it's good to have some of these extreme examples of the most extreme circumstances, because that's what allows you this goes exactly back into what I was talking about with this is a physical representation of this concept with range of motion, is that if you have what's called bandwidth, you have this, you can look at the most extreme perspective, like the most amount of volume that somebody can do and recover from and still make gains, and then the least amount of volume that people can do and recover and still make gains. Then, based on your situation, how many hours you have to train, whether you're playing a sport, whether your goal is just hypertrophy, you can take something and then you can say, look, I have this range of options based on my goals. Look, okay, maybe I can only have 2 days a week to train, so I literally do 1 set to failure, and maybe 1 set to failure isn't super ideal for muscle growth because it's so far on this side of the spectrum, where this is maybe something ideal is kind of somewhere here in the middle, but you can say, well, this is the least I can do, but I'm really going to focus on progressive overload because I know that's the most important thing that I need to do. Or I know that maybe I'm going to try to do just a lot of training in like lengthened ranges of motion because that's going to give me the most bang for my buck based on the amount of volume that I can do per week, right? And so you have these studies that give us good information. It's not to say this is what we should do, because that's the mistake people make. It's saying this is the most extreme example of what we can do on both sides of the spectrum. Let's give you something based on your goals that falls somewhere. Maybe it's over here. Maybe it's over here for bodybuilding. Maybe you just need to break out of a plateau, right? So you do this extreme approach for a really short period of time or something. And the same thing is true for like, your range of motion, right? If you have more options, right? If you can flex your spine all the way, but you can also extend your spine all the way, your body is going to be able to find where it needs to be. Like people talk about posture all the time. And they love to say that everybody needs to stay in a neutral position, right? But if you've never trained the extreme ends of that ranges of motion, your body really doesn't even know what neutral is. It can't find a center point because it doesn't understand where it doesn't understand the ends of your capacity, right? Like your capacity might just be this, and like, neutral is like somewhere in here. So you don't really have anywhere to go, right? And so I think when you look at range of motion, you even start talking about building up a health, like a reserve of energy or a reserve of, just good general physical well-being. You could make the same argument that like if somebody has cancer, that maybe diet doesn't cure their cancer alone, but diet allows them to tolerate the cancer treatments better, or it allows them to remove interference, right? If your gut is inflamed because your diet's crap, and your cancer therapies aren't able to work because you have this huge inflammatory response or whatever it is, you could apply this to anything, then, you're limiting the ability of that intervention or that solution to do what it needs to do because you haven't removed that interference from the system. And you could apply that. All of the stuff we're talking about applies to fitness. It applies to nutrition. It applies to even like just some of these like intellectual theoretical concepts that we've been talking about. That's the cool thing, is like when you begin to look at information this way, it's like that's kind of like that light bulb moment I was talking about, where you can immediately begin to apply these concepts to everything that you do, and you never get into these polarized perspectives, right? If you have that perspective on training and nutrition, you're never going to be the person that gets on Instagram and says, your diet doesn't matter when you have cancer, right? Because it is not going to cure your cancer. Nobody would ever say that. Nobody that actually understands nutrition would actually say that, right? Nobody that understands training at a very deep level would ever say that you just need to do length and partials. Nobody that understands, sprint performance or athletic performance would ever say that you just need to do hip thrusts to get faster, right? And so these things apply. You can lateralize them across the board to a lot of different fields.
Yeah. We'll have to, I'd love to pick your mind on some of your fitness perspectives later date. But the last thing I wanted to ask you on is, how do you bridge the gap between, I need a meta-analysis before I get out of the bed in the morning to, and stretch my toes because it's optimal, and, the anecdote? How do we bridge these two extremes in your eyes?
I think you need to look at, you have to apply it specifically to the thing that you're looking at. And like you can't just say always consider anecdotes, right? Because if we're talking about like a drug trial, I'm not very inclined to listen to 10 people that I know that took a drug that didn't have any side effects from it, right? Because that's, like Vioxx. Vioxx was a drug that killed, I want to say probably like 300,000 people. It killed, it wasn't a statistic, like if you actually look at the amount of people that took the drug, it was only like, I could be butchering the stats, but I think it was only like 1 to 3% or something. But that's still massive, right? That's still huge. And so you can't look at an anecdote to say, well, I don't know anybody that took the drug that got that issue, right? You can't use anecdotes in that sense to say that something is safe or not. That's where you need large scale randomized controlled trials, because that intervention, we know that drugs can kill people, right? Even drugs that have gone through like, Vioxx, a lot of the research was, it was fraudulent. So it wasn't really good research to begin with. But you could look at like, just drugs in general and say, well, we know that drugs are a risky intervention. So we need like lots of safety data on a drug, right? Now, if you're talking about a diet or you're talking about, a lifestyle intervention, that's where I don't think we need a lot of like large scale. it would be great if we had them, right? But for me to say, hey, it would be a good idea for you to eat fish, eggs, chicken, whatever. I think most people, everybody has to eat, right? You can't just not eat. So you can't, but when it comes to taking a drug, you have the choice not to take a drug if you want, right? So there's a different level of scale there in terms of like, well, I have to do these things every day anyway. So I think that it's easier in that case to go off an anecdote where somebody says, look, I cut out all of these inflammatory foods and it made me feel really good, right? And so we could say, well, in that instance, yeah, maybe we can use anecdotes to kind of navigate some of the elements that, were implementing, in somebody's health or nutrition plan on kind of like a small scale, right? This supplement made me feel bad. This, food made me feel really good. Or maybe we're talking about like gene mutations, like a lot of the stuff that Tyler does, where he's working with tons of clients and he's seeing these patterns in like, this person has this gene mutation, so this supplement might not be good for them. Even though we don't have a large randomized controlled trial showing that, it makes sense on paper because mechanistically we can say that this gene mutation influences histamine pathways, and histamine pathways may, if you have a mutation in one of these histamine pathways, you might have trouble with this type of supplement, right? We can build a plan around some of these things that maybe we don't have massive studies for, but that practitioners are seeing really good results in their practice with, right? Like I was talking to Tyler about this in the podcast. He's like, every time I see this mutation and I give this person this supplement because of this mechanistic explanation that I have for this thing, this person improves, right? And so when you start to see that over and over, you can say, well, look, a B vitamin or changing, the type of B vitamin that somebody's taking or this supplement or that supplement, that's relatively low risk, right? And so we can say that, we can exercise our anecdotal experiences in these circumstances. It's not like we're not looking at evidence, right? Truly being evidence-based is considering all available evidence at different levels of scale, right? If we're talking about supplements and things like this, that's a level of scale where we can look at anecdotes. Anecdotes is a form of evidence. We can look at mechanistic data in rat studies and even in very small scale human randomized controlled trials because we're seeing these things with these people with these issues reliably, right? And I think even when you're a practitioner and you're getting a lot of people to have the same issues, that kind of is your randomized controlled trial in a sense. If you've worked with 100 people that all have the same issues, that all have the same gene mutations, it's not double blinded, right? There's massive limitations there in terms of like a good study design, but you could kind of say like, this is my randomized controlled trial, right? Like when I see people for injuries and I have them do PEMF therapy, I can say, look, this is a safe intervention. We have all of these studies showing that PEMF therapy is safe. We might not have studies on PEMF showing that it's good for, tendon regeneration or that it's going to regenerate your cartilage. But we do have studies showing that it's really good for bones. It's FDA approved for bones. So we can take this thing that it does and we can extrapolate that out to maybe it's going to be good for tendons. Maybe it's going to be good for fascia. Maybe it's going to be good for muscle. I'm seeing that in my clinical experience because I've treated 50 different people with all of these different, complex pain syndromes, and they're all getting better. Somebody has an ACL tear, you do PEMF therapy and they get, they heal twice as fast as they normally would. And their doctor's like, what the fuck did you do? Right. And you're seeing all of these things, right? You're getting all of these anecdotes. And you can say, well, I'm going to continue to do this. And I'm going to continue to tell people that I think it might help them because we know that it's safe. It's a low risk intervention and we're seeing good results with it. And we have mechanistic data to show in rat studies, in small human trials, and based on the mechanisms that we know that it works in these circumstances, like in bone and things like that, we can extrapolate that out and say, I think that it would be a good idea for this person to use this in this circumstance because it's safe and because we know this, right? If we're talking about drugs and you try to use that logic and you try to say, well, I've used it on 50 different people and I think it works and I don't know if there's any side effects, you could kill somebody, right? And so I think that's where we need to, those are both the kind of extreme ends of the spectrum, but there's so many topics that kind of fall somewhere in the middle where we can say, all right, maybe this thing is a little bit more risky than just a supplement or a nutritional intervention, but maybe we know that it's not quite as risky as a drug because it's been around for a while and we have enough data to say that it probably isn't going to be that bad, right? Enough people have used it, right? There's enough anecdotal experiences online where we can say, well, I don't think in this circumstance that it's not going to be not worth it, right? Like if you have somebody that's suffering in pain and the option is this new stem cell therapy procedure where we're using gene-edited stem cells or something like that. There's not a whole lot of studies on that, and it is kind of like a big medical intervention. It's not really like, it falls into some of those gray areas, but we can say, well, this person is going to kill themselves. Like they're in that much pain. This person is going to legitimately kill themselves if they don't get something to help them, and nothing on over here is helping them, and nothing in the medical conventional medicine side is helping them. We can say, look, this we know this is relatively low risk because we've seen it in quite a few patients. We can't say that it doesn't have any side effects or that there might not be some downstream risks, but we think that it's going to be worth it for this patient because of this extreme situation, right? Like there's laws for psychedelics, for like psychedelic assisted therapy for depression and anxiety and pain and things like this. We have it with THC. And so we can say, well, we might not have a large scale randomized controlled trial. Unfortunately, it would be great if we did. But based on the information that we do have, we can say reliably that it might be worth it for this person. And so I think when you're looking at anything, you have to just take that sort of spectrum, that perspective, and say, where does the thing that I'm looking at kind of fall on that timeline or that spectrum or that category, so that you can reliably give people things that are going to help them, but also be safe and effective for the issue that they have.
Yeah. Risk reward, basically.
100%. That's the fancy way to say risk versus reward. Yeah.
Yeah. Because it's not like, even with the anecdote stuff, it's not like any people, it's like, oh, I didn't die from Vioxx. It's like, well, that is true. But if you take enough anecdotes, you say like, all right, 1,000 people, no one died, but then you have 1,000 people, 100 died. That's a very different story, right? So it's like the anecdotes are still true. You probably just shouldn't make your decision in that scenario. It's like, it would be like taking who's the motorcyclist that went off the crazy jumps? Crazy stunt dude. Like
I knew what you were talking about. I think I know what you're talking about. Yeah.
It's like him saying, I did this. It's like, it was fine. It's just like, oh yeah, I'll just go and jump off with like 10 cars between that. It's like you got to weigh the pros and cons there, Anybody else that's going to do that is going to get fucked up, right? And
It's funny because a lot of people will say that this is all overcomplicated. Say, oh yeah, it's just basically risk to reward, blah, blah. And it's like, yeah, but nobody's actually looking at the risk. Like there's so many details that go into risk versus reward, that there's a lot of people just entirely ignoring the fact that like risk to reward is a thing, right? You have some people that legitimately, like even with supplements, which is ironic because a lot of these same people sell their own supplements that don't have large scale randomized controlled trials showing that they're completely safe, right? Because they intuitively know that like nobody's going to die if they take this. They might get a headache. And if you get a headache, you just don't take it anymore, right? People understand that there's different levels of scale, but sometimes when it comes to these intellectual pursuits where people, or just even debunking content where somebody really wants to go after a specific person for saying a specific thing, right? It's not really the thing that they're going after. They're going after the person's entire like persona, right? Because if you actually sort of just take a step back and you look at some of the things that the person's promoting, like whether it's a supplement or a biohack, these are all low risk interventions. You have people that like roast Dave Asprey online because some of the things that he says are kind of cringy, right? But then you have all these other things that he says that are really good. That's really good advice that are low risk interventions. Neurofeedback, certain supplements, either like red light, PEMF in there, and people will go and attack some of these modalities and say you shouldn't be telling people to do that. We don't have large scale randomized controlled trials showing that. And what they're really trying to do is they're trying to attack the personality that is Dave Asprey and the conglomerate of ideas that makes up Dave Asprey and some of the cringiness and the way that some of those ideas are delivered. And they're not actually looking at the intervention itself. They're using that as like an umbrella as like a gateway to kind of get in and attack people for certain things, even though the vast majority of things in the biohacking community are relatively low risk. And I would say there's quite a bit of upside for a lot of people. And again, there's certain circumstances where that may not be true. If somebody has cancer, right, like you may not want to give them a ton of herbs and things like that, because in that instance, it's not low risk. It's actually interfering with the cancer treatment, right? So you have to look at the person and say, what does this person have, like an illness or something that may make some of these things contraindicated? And that's also on that risk to reward sort of sliding scale that you have to look at in a very detailed sort of way.
Yeah. Well, Grant, thank you so much for taking the time. Where can everyone find you?
Yeah, absolutely, dude. Thanks for having me on. I think we really got to cover, a lot of stuff that I talk about a lot, but I never get to like talk about, on Instagram, I get to talk about it, but not like on podcast and stuff. If people want to find me, the best way to do that would be probably on Instagram. That's where I'm the most active, and I have links to my website and all of the services that I offer and the things that I sell through Instagram. So people can find me on Instagram. It's Fowler _fitness_SPT. I have a Twitter. I don't even know the handle on it, and I don't use it that much. And all this stuff that I post on Twitter ends up on Instagram anyway. So Instagram is the main place, and then it kind of branches off from there.
Awesome. And definitely make sure to go check out his podcast. He just did one with Dr. Tyler Pansner, which was a great listen.
Yes, that will be up on Spotify and iTunes soon. Right now it's just on YouTube, but it will be on Spotify and iTunes soon.
Sweet. All right, well, we'll have to do this again sometime. I want to pick your brain on some fitness stuff, but we'll save that for another day. Save you some time.
Yeah.
Thanks for coming on again. And until next time, guys, be good.